Every Jewish student on campus has this question. Why are we hated? Why do they hate us so much? Why is Israel hated? Well, a strange hatred. Could you explain it? I was giving a class in the business school at Stanford. It was kind of a lunch and learn. About 40 students were there, mostly non-Jewish. It wasn't by a Jewish group. And they wanted to know about Jewish business ethics. We had a whole nice discussion about Jewish values, Jewish responsibility to others, tzedakah, beautiful ideas. At the end of the class, a student raises their hand during the question and answer session. Rabbi, I have a question, okay? He says, you gave a class about Jewish values, about care and concern and compassion and love. Why is it that the state of Israel, the Jewish state, violates every single one of these principles? Apartheid, ethnic cleansing, racism, Hitler crimes. So people in the classroom, okay. The question really was not appropriate, right? So I said, look, if you want to have a discussion about the Middle East and Israel, we could arrange for that. We'll have the discussion. But because you asked the question, there's a bunch of students here and you asked this question, so I'll give you a brief answer, if that's what you want. He says, yes. I said, tell me, why did you kill your grandmother? He says, what do you mean? I said, just tell us why you killed your grandmother. So he says, what are you talking about? And he starts to get a bit nervous, uncomfortable. I say, are your grandparents alive, all of them? He says, no, my grandmother's not alive. I said, so you admit that she's dead? He says, yes. So I said, why'd you kill her? And people start to laugh because they realize something odd is going on. And I'm kind of yelling at him very seriously. I'm demanding to know why he killed his grandmother. The second he answered that question, he lost the whole argument. I accused him of something bizarre. I accused him of murder in front of a whole class. What did he do? Like a chacham, he started to argue with me. Oh, yes, my grandmother is alive. She's not alive. I did do it. She died of old age. So people understood what was happening. I said, you ask me a question about Israel? What kind of chutzpah was that question? I'm not even going to dignify it with an answer. The moment you begin to answer that kind of question, whatever it is you say, you lost. And when you turn on the television today and you read the newspapers, almost always, that's the conversation we're in. We're trying to explain why we didn't kill our grandmother. It's a lost argument. So how to argue and how to discuss, it's a different topic. But that's the world in which we live. And sadly, often, when you turn on the media, that's the dialogue that's going on. Clarifying the Middle East conflict. What's at the heart of the Middle East conflict? Beyond these interesting discussions that people are having and the defense of these kinds of questions of why did you kill your grandmother? Let's travel back to a piece in the Talmud that I think gives good clarity onto the situation today, and it puts many things into perspective. The Talmud is in Tractate Chulin, page 139, if you want to look it up. It's very fascinating, very powerful. The Talmud asks an interesting question. Here's the question. Where do we find a source in the Torah for Haman? Haman was the Jew hater who wanted to wipe out the Jewish people. In Persia, the story of Purim. He was the viceroy of Achashverosh, superpower. The Persian Empire was the superpower of that time. an evil man, and he wants to wipe out the Jewish people. One of the first warranted genocides because he wants to kill men, women, and children in one day. And at the last minute, his plan was averted. So we have Purim and we celebrate. So here's the Talmud's question. Where do we find a reference to Haman in the Torah? Haman min ha-Torah minayin. Okay, now that's a very strange question. Why? Because Haman lived hundreds of years after the Torah was sealed and given and written. So how do you have a reference to a Jew hater in the Torah? The Talmud answers the question. The Talmud says, you want reference to Haman in the Torah? I'll tell you where Haman is found in the Torah. In the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, after they eat from the tree, God comes to Adam and Eve and he asks them, Hamin ha'etz, from the tree, asher tzivisicha, that I commanded you not to eat from. Did you eat from that tree? From the tree I commanded you not to eat from, you ate from? Now in Hebrew, in the Torah, the line is Hamin ha'etz, from the tree. From the tree. How do you say from in Hebrew? Hamin. Hey, mem, nun. From the tree. How do you spell Haman? Hey, mem, nun. Haman, Haman. Same letters. So the Talmud says, we found Haman in the Torah. He's in the story of the Garden of Eden. From the tree I commanded you not to eat from. That's the Talmud's answer. It's a bizarre Talmud. What is it, a game of Scrabble? I mean, the words from the tree have no correlation to Haman. There's no connection. So what is the Talmud driving out? And I argue that the Talmud is getting to a root cause of animosity that is in the world today, and it really defines the essence of the conflict in the Middle East. The Talmud wasn't playing a Scrabble game. The Talmud was bothered by a very profound question, a question that we struggle with today. Every Jewish student on campus has this question. Why are we hated? Why do they hate us so much? Why is Israel hated? Well, a strange hatred. Could you explain it? The Talmud wants to know, why do we have a character who wants to wipe out men, women, children? They did nothing to him, all in one day. It's not about territory. What did the Jews do to Haman? Why does he hate them so much? So the Talmud's question is, Haman min ha-Torah minayin, where do we find insight into Haman's hatred? Why the animosity? What is his psychological profile? What animates him? Does the Torah shed light on to this type of animosity? Because if it does, and we understand the reason for it, or what motivates it, then we could go about trying to deal with it properly. So the Talmud answers, we do find his profile in the Torah, in the Garden of Eden story. Analyze the story of the Garden of Eden, you'll understand Haman well. Adam and Eve had everything. Paradise, right? They had paradise. Everything was kosher. Everything was beautiful, lovely. So they had great environment, great genes, perfect space. Everything kosher. The only thing they didn't have was the fruit from one tree. They had everything. But Adam and Eve decided that even though we have paradise, and we have God as our maker, it's not enough. There's one fruit that we can't eat. Nah, can't live like that. We have to be able to eat everything. There's nothing that we cannot have. We can't live in a space where there's something off limits to us. We have to have everything. And because they wanted everything, they lost everything. Because they broke God's command not to eat from that one tree, paradise lost. They ended up east of Eden. Right? Steinbeck's title, East of Eden. Why did they end up east of Eden? Because that's what they did. So that was Adam and Eve. Now the Talmud is drawing an analogy to Haman based on that. Not that they were evil or wicked like Haman, God forbid. Different category. But there's an interesting psychological parallel between the two. Who was Haman? Look at Haman's personality. Haman was a man that the scroll of Esther tells us. He was an individual that had everything. He had power. He had wealth. He had fame. He had a wife that loved him. And he had a very large, loving family. These are all descriptions in the Megillah itself. Kvoid Ashrei, wealth and power, and a wife and children. He was the second most powerful and influential man, the capital of the great ancient city. So what caused the hatred and the animosity? The story of Megillah tells us. Everybody was commanded to bow to him. Everybody had to subjugate themselves to him, to bow to him. Mordechai HaYehudi, there was this one Jew, Lo yichrev lo yishtachava, said, I'm sorry, I don't bow to you, I exist. My existence doesn't bow to you, I bow to God, to God's morality, to a different vision. I march to a different drummer. You, I know your character, and you're the last person on the planet I'll bow to. Lo yichrev lo yishtachava. I will not bow. Doesn't matter if there's a decree, a Jew doesn't bow. Right? We're called am kshei oiref, stiff-necked people. If you have a stiff neck, what is the one thing you don't do? Bow. He doesn't bow. So the text tells us Haman passes Mordechai. And he sees Mordechai doesn't bow. And he gets so angry and so filled with rage and hatred. Vayivez be'inav, he becomes angry. And he says, I'm not only going to get rid of Mordechai, who doesn't bow down to me, I'm going to wipe out all of his people, because they're all little Mordechais. They all really don't bow to me, he says. And he adds, V'chol zeh eineh shaveh li, everything that I have, all my wealth and all my power, is all worthless to me as long as Mordechai exists in the court of the king. That's what he says. So, Haman was a man who had the whole world. He had everything. But because he didn't have Mordechai, and didn't dominate Mordechai too, he said, everything I have is worthless because I can't stand the existence of otherness. I have to dominate Mordechai too. And because he couldn't have it, he almost destroyed the Jewish people. But in the end, he destroyed himself. Paradise lost. Everything he had was lost in his attempt to destroy others. The conflict in the Middle East has nothing to do with land or territory. Do you think the Palestinians or the Arab world or the Muslim world wants a 22nd Arab state? You think that's what the conflict is about? That has nothing to do with the conflict in the Middle East. It's about one thing. The Jews can't have one state. That's what it's about. If they wanted a state, they could have had a state many years ago. Jews can't have a state. There's 170 states or nations, states that are Christian, 56 Muslim states. The chutzpah that the Jews want a state? What kind of chutzpah is that? And the size of the state? Such a big space they want. As big as New Jersey. Chutzpah. They can't have it. They can't have a state. And that's what the conflict has always been about. Not, we need more land. The Jews can't have any land. In 1948, before the state was declared, United Nations said partition. We'll give some to the Jews, some to the Arabs living there. The Jews accepted. The Arabs said no. Why did they say no? They said the Jews can't have a state. No land for the Jews. Okay. Day one, when Israel declared its independence, it was attacked by all its neighbors. No one thought it was going to survive. Miraculously, it survived. 1967, Israel was surrounded by all its neighbors. The leader of Egypt then said, our goal is not to create another state. His goal was, listen to what Nasser said, is to wipe the Jewish state off the map. That was their goal. They say it clearly. Jews can't have a state. Israel did a preemptive strike. Again, they survived, expanded their territory. And when the war was over, they said, okay, let's make peace. All the Arabs went to Khartoum. They came out with the famous declaration, 3 no's. No recognition of Israel, no negotiation, no peace. Israel can't exist. So the conflict in the Middle East could be solved in one sentence. It's the easiest conflict to describe in the world. It's very not complex. Israel recognizes every Arab state and every Christian state, and is even trying to build another Arab state. That's a separate discussion. But they certainly recognize every Arab state and are prepared to create a new one. I'm not discussing right now if that's a good thing, a wise thing, or a destructive thing. But the fact is that they recognize every Arab state, and the Arabs, the vast majority of the Arab states, don't recognize the Jewish state. Those are the two sides. Every time Israel wants to make peace, 73 again, let's make peace. We recognize you. Will you recognize us? The Arab states say, no, we will not recognize you. Put the whole conflict very simple. And I challenge anybody here, doesn't have to be in the room, but challenge somebody who you have a discussion with about the Middle East. Very simple statement. If tomorrow morning Israel decided, in the name of peace, it's going to put down its weapons, it will fight no more, what will happen to Israel?
It'll disappear.
Israel is gone. If the Arabs tomorrow morning put down their weapons and say, we will fight no more, what will happen? There will be peace. Is there any honest, intelligent person that can argue with that statement? Is there? So that's what the Talmud was saying. The Talmud was saying it's not about... Haman wasn't arguing with the Jews that he wanted more space in Shushan. He didn't say, if you give me some more territory, your synagogue's too big, give me a little wing of your synagogue and we'll have peace. It wasn't about that. He didn't want the existence of a Jew that doesn't bow to him. And as long as you exist, we're in a state of war. So what is Israel supposed to do? That's the situation in the Middle East. This is a bit hard for Jews to comprehend, so I'll give 2 examples. And let me just say this, it needs to be stated in these conversations always. Of course, you and I understand there are hundreds of millions of Muslims that are good and decent and kind. Obviously. But that's not the point. We are discussing the states around Israel that seek its destruction. In Germany, before the war, or during the Holocaust. You think all Germans were bad? Of course not. There are millions of wonderful Germans. There's no question about it. Millions of innocent German children, and I'm sure millions of innocent German citizens. But the Holocaust happened because the people in power and the dominant influence in society created a Holocaust and destroyed the Jewish people. So in terms of practical reality on the ground, certainly there are hundreds of millions of Muslims that are kind and decent people. But we're talking about the enemy Israel faces. We're talking about the media and the reality on the ground. So, 2 examples. 2003, in Iran, there was a massive earthquake. 40,000 people died in that earthquake. Iran said everybody can help. They couldn't handle the situation. They were hit by a massive earthquake. The world's leading expert in quick rescue of buildings that have fallen in from disaster and bombs is Israel. Israel said, we're prepared to fly over. They're 2-hour flight. And we'll help. We'll give you everything we got. And Israel has gone to many places and helped. We're prepared to come in and save your children. There are tens of thousands of children under rubble. We'll fly in and save your children. What did Iran say? No. That's a fact. They said no, and Israel didn't go. Many women, men, children, innocent children in Iran died. It seems that in parts of our world, hatred of the Jew, hatred of Israel, is more powerful than love of your own children. For a Jewish mother, that's very hard to understand. I have a lot of wonderful Jewish liberal friends. It's very hard to understand that notion. Doesn't make sense to them. But this is not even, we're not talking about a war. We're talking about an earthquake when you can have experts saving your own children. They said, no, this is not a new phenomenon. There's a very powerful book about the Holocaust by Lucy Davidowitz, The War Against the Jews, and she has a chapter in that book that describes Hitler's first war was the war against the Jews. Hitler was more concerned with killing Jews than winning the war. And she documents it in the book very, very powerfully. One example she uses is when they needed to evacuate from Russia or bring German soldiers to Russia, they stopped all trains that were not for military because the German army was being decimated. So they stopped every civilian train in all of the German territory, except the trains carrying little skeleton Jews, little Anne Franks, hundreds of miles across Europe so they can go to a gas chamber. He was losing the war. Every soldier that he wouldn't put into one of the fronts would cost the army. He didn't care. Because as Lucy Davidowitz correctly points out, his first war was the war against the Jews. Hitler was more concerned with killing Jews than winning the war. The same thing happened in Greece when the Germans needed to evacuate. They were getting clobbered in Greece. The trains, all the trains bringing Jews to the death camps, you can't touch them. One of the generals suggested, one of Hitler's generals, said we have to get rid of the Jews in a very efficient way, but it shouldn't destroy our own war efforts. He was demoted and kicked out of the army. Very silly suggestion. So this notion that you have a hatred against the Jewish people and you want their destruction or you don't want them to have a state and that it can be very deep exists, and that's at the heart of the conflict in the Middle East. Now, I want to share with you a bad joke, but this is how it goes. So I give you warning, you're forewarned. There's a fellow, Mr. Cohn. He's 95 years old, and he wasn't feeling so well. So he goes to the doctor, he waits a week, the doctor calls him. He said, I have bad news and I have worse news. So he says, Oi, Gewalt, give me the bad news first. He says, the bad news is, I got the results from your blood test. You only have 24 hours to live. He says, that's terrible. What on earth could be worse than that? He says, I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. So that was the bad news. Now we're going to go to the worst news. First part, we have a very dangerous foe. Let's go to another topic here that comes into play. Okay, so you have a conflict in the Middle East of people that really don't want you to exist. How on earth is a group that doesn't want you to exist in the Middle East able to influence so much of the world that you're an evil state and you're the aggressor and you're the guilty party? How were they able to pull that off? How does that happen? Why don't people see the conflict in a clear way? It's very clear to see it. So generally, as has been pointed out by Ruth Weiss, a Harvard professor, and others, anti-Semitism in the last 2,000 years has mutated 4 times. We're living through the 4th mutation now. Very briefly, what are the 3 mutations and the 4th that we're living through now? It used to be before the birth of Christianity, Jews were disliked, but it wasn't because of religious purposes. It wasn't a war between 2 faiths. They weren't liked because money or jealousy or difference. As one person put it, before the mafia kills somebody, they say, it's nothing personal. Right? We can't have you around, nothing personal. So the Jews were hated, but it wasn't so personal. The first major mutation comes about the birth of Christianity. Birth of Christianity, anti-Semitism becomes very personal. You don't accept our Messiah, you're accused of killing Messiah, or not accepting our traditions or our faith, you challenge our faith. So anti-Semitism in the first mutation, the beginning of Christianity, becomes very personal. That's mutation number one. Mutation number two, around 1096, during the Crusades, when Jews are not only accused of being stubborn or not accepting a true faith, beginning somewhere around 1096, you look through the literature and you read history, Jews start becoming guilty of everything that goes wrong in the world. The plague, the bubonic plague is the Jewish responsibility. We poison wells, we kill Christian children, we drink their blood, the blood libels, the crusades. Everything that goes wrong in the world, the Jews are demons and devils. And we're blamed for everything. And that went on in Europe for a very long time. All you need to do is think of the words that were added to the lexicon because of this hatred. Pogrom, expulsion, autodafé, ghetto, and culminating in a Holocaust. All these words come out of the Jewish experience in Europe. A lot of it emanated from this demonization of the Jew. So that was another mutation. Third mutation, late 1800s, William Marr coins a new phrase, German journalist, antisemitism. 1879 it was. Antisemitism. Why did he coin a new phrase? Because you needed a new word to describe what was going on in Europe. Christianity was losing its power. You're talking about after the Enlightenment and emancipation. So what were Jews accused of doing then? Not being good citizens, stabbing Germany in the back, not being loyal citizens, dual citizenship. It wasn't a religious hatred, it became a racism or a genetic type of hatred. That's what it mutated to. So it wasn't for religious reasons anymore. It was the Jew as a subspecies or a subrace. You got to get rid of them. That was the third. Now we're living through the fourth mutation. What's the fourth mutation? Fourth mutation is, it's not religious in terms of Christian. It's not Christian hatred against the Jew. It's not that we're not loyal to the countries we live in. That went on for 2,000 years. Right now, how does the anti-Semite express himself? Exactly. Anti-Zionism. Every state, every people is allowed to have a state except the Jews. 56 Muslim states, 100 and something, 70 Christian states. The Jewish people are the only people that can have a state. That's the first principle in the new anti-Semitism. The second principle is every Jew is a Zionist. Therefore, every Jew is a legitimate target. It doesn't matter if you're in Europe or in America. If you're Jewish, you're a Zionist, you're a legitimate target. And every Jewish institution is a Zionist institution, so every synagogue on earth is a legitimate target. That's principle 2. And principle 3 is they recycled every myth that existed in Europe for 2,000 years is recycled with a bit of modern language. So we're responsible for every tidal wave and disaster. We're responsible for 9/11. We're responsible for everything that goes on in the world that is not good. You could Google this. I suggest you don't. But if you look at the anti-Semitic websites, we think it's funny. You say, what? People think Israel's responsible for 9/11? There are tens of millions of people that believe it. There are whole television series in countries that teach this to children. But all the myths that were around in Europe for 1,000 years are all recycled. So those are the 3 principles of anti-Semitism today. Fourth mutation. Now here's the most relevant question. This gets to the heart of the issue. How are they able to convince the world to line up against Israel or to confuse the moral issue? How? It seems so simple to us. There's good and bad. There's one group that recognizes others and allows for existence of others, and one group that says you can't exist. Why doesn't everybody see it? But can't you ask the same question about anti-Semitism for 2,000 years? How was it always successful? How was it always successful? And the answer is the same. Anti-Semites always use the same exact tactic, and they're using it today brilliantly. How do you get many wonderful innocent men and women and children and college students to hate one group and even allow or justify its extinction or its decimation. How? You always have to appeal to the highest authority, the most influential source of authority of the time, and say that the Jews are destroying what is most precious and most meaningful in the world today. And if the Jews are against that, then we, if we're good people, need to be against the Jews. So in the Christian world, in the Dark Ages, what was the highest source of authority? What was the most important thing in the world? Christianity, Christian God, the Christian faith, the church. So what were the Jews accused of doing? Destroying all those things, even killing God. I don't know how you can kill a God. It's a separate issue. But Jews were accused of destroying what was most cherished in the society. And if the Jews kill our God and our Messiah and so forth, then the Jews are the devil. We have to persecute them. And even if they're killed a bit or a lot, that's okay. So that's how anti-Semitism, the anti-Semites got away with Jew hatred for hundreds of years. But then what did the anti-Semites do when people stopped believing in the founder of Christianity as a son of God or Messiah, where the church stopped holding sway over all of Europe? When there was enlightenment and emancipation, and people said, we don't believe in any of these things. What does the anti-Semite do? You want to get rid of the Jew. You hate the Jew. How do you get decent people to believe that? So what was the highest ideal of the ancient world then? Not the ancient world, but you go back 1700s, the 1800s. Nationalism, or pseudoscience, a kind of social Darwinism, that there's a higher species and lower species, stuff that Nietzsche would talk about, and then later on, where the Nazis used for their own propaganda. Nietzsche, of course, didn't mean it the way it was applied later. But they took pseudoscience, nationalism. Science then was the ultimate God. And nationalism, and they said the Jews are an inferior race. The German race, let's say in Europe, during the time of the Holocaust, were the pure race. The Jews are contaminating all of mankind. They stabbed Germany in the back. They accused the Jews of going against nationalism and destroying our race. If you have a people that are destroying your nationality and destroying your race, terrible people, you have to get rid of them. Successful. After the Holocaust, after the Jews, in a way, taught the world that the worst thing possible is genocide and killing people, how do you get people to hate Jews? You can't say we hate them because of their faith, in terms of Christianity. That doesn't work today. You can't say, oh, they're against science. How would that go over? Jews are against science. And besides, science is not the highest authority today anymore, where people could bring destruction. People don't think science is going to fix everything today. There's a great concern over where science will go. What is the highest authority today? Peace. What are the worst things one could do? Genocide is the worst thing. Apartheid is the worst thing. Racism is the worst thing. In a way, the Jews helped teach this to the world. So if you want to get people to hate Israel, what do you need to accuse Israel of doing? Exactly that. You have to accuse the Jews of doing what is considered to be the worst thing one could do today. The worst thing somebody could do today is genocide. Therefore, Israel needs to be accused of genocide. That's how we're going to get people to hate them. So in a demonic inversion of history, they accuse the Jewish people of everything that happened to us for 2,000 years. And if you could convince people that the Jews are responsible for ethnic cleansing and genocide and war crimes, do you ever wonder why it is? Literally, a few days ago, Prime Minister of Turkey, he says Israel's worse than the Nazis. So a rational Jew thinks, why does he make that statement? You want to criticize Israel a little bit, say they overreacted, have a rational discussion. You're saying the Jews are worse than Hitler, even if you're the most anti-Israel person. How many people died in the conflict in the last month? 2,000, I'm not even discussing how many were terrorists, if it was collateral damage. Put that all aside. How many Jews were murdered in the Holocaust? How does a rational person even compare what's happening in Israel? I'm talking about even if you're the most And the discussion about Israel, you're completely anti-Israel. Does one even say that? He's not saying it by accident. He's saying it for a reason. If you want people to hate Israel, you can't say, oh, you overreacted. You have to say you're worse than Hitler. And they're saying that all the time. There's a reason for why Israel is vilified and why it's vilified in the way that it is. What's our response? There's three responses. There's a response that we have to tell ourselves. There's a response to the Jewish community. There's a response to the world, to our friends. We have many, many friends. America is filled with people. The vast majority of America is very friendly to the Jewish people and to Israel. The world is filled with our friends, not only in America, around the world. There's a response to our friends, to the vast majority of humanity that is good and decent. And then there's a response to anti-Semites. Three different responses. Part of the response to ourselves is this. Wittgenstein, who was a philosopher, once defined philosophy this way. He said, what is the task of a philosopher? The task of a philosopher is, if you look at a soda bottle, and a fly sometimes goes into the soda bottle, and then it tries to leave the bottle, it can't. It goes back and forth. It crashes its head against the glass walls back and forth. It buzzes back and forth for hours and hours, for a half a day. And then what happens? It just dies. It's exhausted and it dies. What does the fly forget to do? To look up. It forgets to look up. So Wittgenstein said the job of a philosopher is to teach the fly to look up, to teach a human being to think higher. That's how he defined the task of a philosopher. What has Israel forgotten to do, in a sense? To look up. I think if they would look up, there's a very powerful solution. It's still complicated in terms of resolving all the issues, but I think an overall solution is up. I'm not referring to God. I'm referring to El Al, to Israel's airline. Look at it, El Al. El Al, if you ask a terrorist, I'm not saying you should ask a terrorist, but if you ask a terrorist what airline you could bomb, one airline, what airline would every terrorist select? There's no question. El Al is the most coveted airline in the skies. El Al has been hated, and terrorists would love to take out an El Al plane. What is the safest airline? What is the gold standard for aviation security? El Al. Everybody learns from El Al. After 9/11, every single airline went to El Al. They had training. A lot of what now is implemented in every airport was all learned from El Al. And you'll remember, those who flew El Al before 9/11, they had all the security measures that now everybody does. El Al is a safe airline. For who is it safe? For Jews, for Gentiles, for Christians, for Muslims, for everybody. It's the safest airline. And it's a model of security and safety. What happens if El Al would say, for some reason, they have a meeting, for some reason we're hated, a lot of people want to destroy us. It must be we're doing something wrong. Okay, let's grant autonomy to 15 seats on our plane. We'll allow the people that hate us to come in, monitor their own security on that section of the plane. And this will be an awesome gesture to show our love and understanding and our appreciation. And this will assuage their grievances somehow. And then we'll be like everybody else. Maybe we'll give them a little bit of control of the cockpit. And maybe they'll have their own little security checkpoint in the airport and they'll check the passengers, What would everybody... You're laughing. Why are we laughing? Because we know if that would happen, what would happen to Israel's airline? What would happen a week from now? It would be blown out of the sky. Jews would die. Muslims would die. The airline would close down. It would be non-functional. You can't do that. but only because El Al knows who its airline belongs to. El Al has no doubt. Who does it belong to? Israel. All of it? Yes. You want to negotiate a couple seats? No, never. Why not? Because you're crazy. Finished. End of discussion. You want to negotiate your seats? Do it on your airline. What kind of chutzpah is that? You crazy? Unheard of. And so why don't you want to give a seat? Because we want to have a safe airline for humanity. But people hate you. Yes, they hate us, but their hatred is their problem, not ours. Why would an airline think that we can give you a seat and we're going to cure your hatred? You need to go to a doctor, a therapist, you need to learn some Pirkei Avos, but you need to deal with your own hatred. We can't solve it by compromising security on our airline. So Israel says that about its plane. All Israel needs to do is look at its country, decide what belongs to them. Whatever it is they decide they're never going to compromise on, say it. This belongs to us. It is ours. We will never negotiate an inch of it, ever. And if you try or even think of trying to harm any citizen here, you will be destroyed, even before you get onto this piece of territory or airline. You know what the El Al security looks like? You know when you buy a ticket, they're already starting to scrutinize your background and where you had coffee the other day and so forth. But it works. So it is true that if you look up the articles written on El Al every once in a while, when the New York Times needs to blame something on Israel, 7 years ago, they would blame El Al for, you're a bit harsh in the way you scrutinize people of certain genders coming from certain countries, the racial profiling. Okay, so once in a while, you have a bad article about Israel. By the way, the New York Times writer writes that on El Al when they're flying to Israel. They're not flying on another airline. Where's the boat? Why are you on this airline? Whatever. Right, so fine, you write your article, you write it on El Al, and the whole world will respect us. All Israel needs to do is treat its land like its airline. There would be peace in Israel decades ago. That's it. But the second you compromise on any of the principles that Al would never consider compromising, you have a big problem, and that's the problem we face in Israel. I want to conclude with the last message to ourselves, so I'll conclude with that. Let me go to the other two. To our friends. To our friends, it really goes to a broader topic, and that is when Abraham was first selected by God, the first syllables of Jewish history. God selects Abraham. Know what he says? He says, Abraham, I'm selecting you. And this is the only instance in the Torah where we know why God selects Abraham. There are other reasons, but this is the one the Torah itself says. Ki edaitiv, because I know, l'man asher yitzaveh es banav, v'es beis hayachrav. I know that Abraham is a person that's going to educate his family to do moral kindness and justice and behave compassionately. And in that same verse, a few words later, it says, and through Abraham and his family and his moral and ethical principles that he teaches to his family and his children, the whole world will be blessed. Through the Jewish philosophy of ethics and morality and kindness, human beings made in divine image and so on and so forth, though humanity will be blessed. So this notion of tikkun olam and light unto the nations wasn't made up somewhere in Berkeley, a few decades ago. It's the first syllables that set Jewish history in motion. We are responsible to be committed and kind Jews, but we're commanded to teach the world, to bring them to God and to ethical monotheism, to key moral principles, generally speaking, 7 universal principles. So for many years, for millennia, Jews couldn't do that. Fine. But the moment Jews are able to do it, and for the last decades we've been able to, now we're able to, in all the free countries, we're able to be an influential voice in every arena of influence, politics, finance, free country. Jewish people say, we're still busy with many things, but we're not up to that mitzvah yet. We're not influencing the world so much. The public schools, whatever. We can't afford that luxury. Who decided Jews have the luxury to ignore the words that set our history in motion? Who decided we have the luxury not to teach the world about goodness and morality? You know what the problem is? If there's a vacuum in teaching the world, if we don't teach, others will teach. And most often in history, the other morality systems or the other things that are taught are not good. They're bad for humanity. They're certainly bad for the Jews. So we can't afford to leave a vacuum. The Jewish community, we need to tell this to ourselves, that we have a responsibility. We all have a circle of influence. Everybody has a very large circle of influence that they can influence today, especially with media and so forth. We are commanded to be a moral influence in the world. And if we don't do it, there's going to be other people teaching other things. So that's something we need to recognize. So the Jew sometimes says, oh, look what's going on. Look what people are being taught. So we need to teach. That's one thing to keep in mind. But another thing to keep in mind is what Eric Hoffer said. Eric Hoffer was a brilliant longshoreman who wrote small books. He was a brilliant man. He wrote, and he wasn't Jewish, and he wrote some very interesting things about Israel. But one of the things that he wrote, I believe he wrote it right after 1967. He wrote that Israel is the miners' canaries of the world. And he explained what he meant. He says, miners, when they would go into a mine, when they dig deep under the earth, you have noxious fumes that are released. Sometimes. If you hit one of those pockets. The noxious fumes kill human beings. The problem is the fumes are not detectable. You can't smell the fume. So what happened to the miners is the fumes would be released, they would all die in the mine. What did the miners do? They brought canaries down with them. Canaries are very susceptible to the fumes. They die very rapidly. So when the miners would see the cage of the canaries start to die, they know they had a certain amount of time to leave. They would say, okay, time to pack out. So those are called the miners' canaries. So Hoffer said the Jews are the miners' canaries in human history. Whenever you have an evil ideology, that it could be Hitler's Third Reich or Stalin's Russia or Mao, or every ideology you go across history, you have an evil ideology, they're often going to attack the greatest competitor or the greatest force that opposes their ideology, and that's going to be the Jewish people. They're going to attack the Jews and the Jewish people and Jewish thought process. And after they finish with the Jews, the canary, they'll go on to do the rest of their business. And if you look at history, that's exactly what happened. That Jews are always attacked, and then they move on to their next victim. And usually, almost without exception, the whole country implodes in that act of evil. Eventually, it all comes tumbling down. In the 20th century, that's what happened to Hitler's Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years. That's what happened to communism. The Jews were devastated, but the whole country imploded afterwards. So Hoffer says the Jews are the miners' canary. That needs to be taught to the world as well. That this strand of Islam that says the Jews cannot exist and they cannot have a state and we will never recognize it and our whole goal is simply to destroy it, that is not merely a Jewish problem, that is a human problem. And rational people are open to understanding these things. It's probably not put to them often, but that's something that we need to tell our friends. I mean, what happens if a miner is in a mine and the canaries die and they say, oh, the canary had a heart attack. Tough luck. Canary's fault. The canary ate too much junk food. The miner's a fool. Well, that's what happens when people say it's the Jews' problem. By the way, often the Jews figure out how to deal with the problem and the world doesn't. Hijacking began against Israel, against the Jews. Now the only people that don't suffer from it are the Jews. Others suffer from it. A lot of the terrorism that takes place in the world today, it started in Israel, and a lot of it Israel figured out how to deal with. The suicide bombing on the buses, Israel figured out very much how to deal with it, not perfectly. But you have the problem in all other countries as well. You literally could track a lot of the antisemitism, and once it was successful in one place, how it gets exported. So that's the second thing. What do we have to tell anti-Semites? The same thing Mordechai told Haman. The same thing Elul tells the world. What did Mordechai say? Mordechai was confronted with somebody who wanted to wipe him and all his people off the map. Mordechai didn't sit down and negotiate. He didn't give away synagogues in Shushan. He called the Jews to prayer, to become better Jews, prouder Jews. And he took the political steps necessary with Esther in a very wise fashion to undermine Haman completely and to eradicate him from the scene. But he never compromised an inch. He never bowed a centimeter. If Mordechai would have bowed an inch to Haman, we would not have Purim. We would be on the gallows, not Haman. And that is what Israel needs to do. Israel cannot compromise an inch. It cannot bow. It needs to be very clear. It has to stand with moral integrity and righteous integrity and with military might. And if it doesn't compromise and stands very strong, like Mordechai, there will be peace. Haman would have destroyed all of Persia. Mordechai, the Megillah ends. How does the Megillah end? It says that there was peace and tranquility in all of Persia. It wasn't only for the Jews. They got rid of Haman and Haman's group of killers and thugs, and there was peace in all of Shushan. Finally, to the Jewish people. We'll end with these two quick insights, and then we'll do some questions. The former chief rabbi of England, Rabbi Sachs, told the story of one of his colleagues that was in Russia shortly after the fall of communism. The fellow was in Russia. He was a religious rabbi. He may have been a Chabad rabbi, I'm not sure, but he had a black hat, Rabbi Sachs tells, and he had the garments, a kapata, and a beard. He looked like a Hasidic rabbi in Russia, 1990, 91. He was there for a year. A woman comes over and tells him, Rabbi, I have a problem. He says, what's the problem? He says, during communism, no one knew I was Jewish. I hid my identity. No one knew I was Jewish. At least that's what I thought. I certainly didn't publicize I was Jewish, and no one ever told me anything. No anti-Semitic incident, as long as communism existed. Comes 1990, 89, 90. Communism falls. And suddenly I walk on the street in my neighborhood, they know I'm Jewish, and teenagers and others start saying, Jid, Jid. They call anti-Semitic slurs. They call out as I walk by from the window, a teenager here, there. Because during communism, communism was terrible, but it kept things under control a bit. Because now there's anarchy and freedom, so people are expressing what they feel. So she was talking to him about this problem. So the rabbi tells her, it's very interesting. I've been here for about a year. I do not hide my Jewish identity. Everybody knows I'm Jewish. It's clear that I'm Jewish. It's visibly evident. No one calls out to me any derogatory term. Why do you think that is? You hide your identity and people are harassing you. I'm visibly Jewish and no one ever says, hey, you Jew, hey, you. No one says that. Why? So she said, it's a good question. Let me think about it. So she thought about it for about a minute and she smiled. She said, I know the answer. He says, what? He says, they have a sense. They know. In my neighborhood, they certainly know that I'm a bit ambivalent about my Jewishness. They know. They know if they call out and say, hey, you Jew, it's going to bother me. It's going to make me feel uncomfortable. So they enjoy it. They watch me squirm. They say Jew. But people see you on the street. They know right away you're a chassid, whatever you are. If they say, hey, Jew, you're going to start dancing. You're going to say, yes, I'm a Jew. Come wrap tefillin or whatever. You're going to start a little Torah class on the street. So they don't want to make you happy. They're just not going to say anything. When there is anti-Semitism in the world, the worst thing the Jew could do is be ambivalent and become a victim and cower. The best thing the Jew could do is to stand proud, to stand with Israel, to stand with one's Jewish identity clear, not to cower when Israel comes under attack, but to defend it clearly and morally and truthfully. Not to get into the arguments of why we killed our grandmother. That's not a discussion we have. To have the real discussion, to set the agenda straight, as Mordechai did. And finally, something that, even though the times are difficult, something that is very critical to keep in mind. There's a fellow named Jerry Levine. He runs a company that produces film for cars, commercials for cars, for electronics. Very successful company, Higher Authority Productions. He used to make the commercials for Chrysler and Toyota. He lives in Florida. Jerry Levine, his background was Jewish, completely assimilated background, no Jewish education. When he was in his 40s, successful, he's in Florida, he met Rabbi Lipsker in Florida, started to go to Chabad, the shul there in Bell Harbor, studying, and it really affected him. He started to rely. And he started to become more engaged, a bit of kosher, a bit of Shabbat, making changes in his life. So I heard the story from him, a beautiful story. He says he had one crisis of faith in that period. What was the crisis? A few months into this, he was in New Jersey, new Hanukkah time. He had a rush job to finish up some commercials. The whole team was doing final cuts. Big snowstorm. Hanukkah, Christmas were the same time. He said, I'm riding through town. We have a few hours. We're going to work through the night to finish this thing. And I'm going through the center of town and I see a holiday tree with 1 million lights, 6 stories high. It was the dazzling, beautiful sight. And this man's into the visual. This is his profession. And he very much appreciated it. He said, and then he was horrified to see in the little shadow. It took him about a minute to realize in the shadow of the tree was a puny 6-foot-tall menorah with a couple oil lanterns on the bottom, 7 candles, 8 candles lit. Barely could see it. And to him, the image was very jarring because the tree represented secular America, the way he always lived. The menorah represented an ancient faith with its small oil lanterns. And he figured, maybe I'm headed in the wrong direction. This stuff looks passé, it's a bit outdated. The lights is where it's at. So he says he rode to the shop and he was a bit feeling down because this image evoked a lot. They're working for 2-3 hours and the storm continues. It's snowing heavy in the winds and suddenly they hear a loud explosion. The power goes out because of the snow. And the whole office is plunged in darkness. So they stop working and he's driving back, pitch black. And he comes to the center of town. And as he enters the center of town, it's pitch black, but from every glass window in this town, from every white piece of snow, you see menorah lights reflecting everywhere. It was the only light in the entire town. And he says you could see it from almost a mile away. The human eye could see a candle from 10 miles in complete darkness. But he said it was an awesome sight. He said he started to cry. He couldn't drive. He needed to pull over. He felt the snowstorm was God's message to him. Carry the light, the eternal light of the Jewish people, the light of the menorah, the warmth of our tradition. Carry it in your heart. Be a proud Jew. Stand with Am Yisrael and with Eretz Yisrael. Defend it proudly and strongly. The other forces are difficult and we're at a difficult moment, but they will fade and our light and our nation will live and shine and flourish. May it be speedily in our days. Amen.